In 1862, Union soldiers entered a plantation estate southeast of Nashville expecting the usual signs of flight: burned papers, stripped valuables, hurried abandonment. Instead, they found breakfast still rotting on plates, a clock stopped mid-tick, a journal left open, the sentence unfinished, like the author believed he'd return any moment. The house felt wrong, too still, as if it was holding its breath. 4 days later, a soldier moved a sack in the root cellar and heard a hollow sound beneath his boot. What rose from that hatch was not just stench, it was the odor of prolonged human despair. Months of breath trapped underground, months of waste, months of fear. And when a lantern finally descended into the earth, it revealed something the men who saw it would never fully escape. Children, not prisoners of war, not criminals. Children, silent, skeletal, and terrified of light itself. They didn't cry out. They didn't speak. They stared like creatures dragged out of a cave after a lifetime in darkness. Some had forgotten how to stand. Others had forgotten how to speak. 2 never walked back into daylight at all. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Because the man who did this was not a madman in chains. He was not an outcast. He was educated, respected, praised for his efficiency. A plantation master celebrated for innovation, a man who believed he was doing science, a man who believed control was truth, and that human beings, especially children, were raw material. This wasn't chaos. This was design. What happened beneath that Tennessee estate was not an accident of cruelty. It was a prototype, a controlled environment, a system meant to strip identity, manufacture obedience, and prove a theory that powerful institutions would later quietly adopt, then deny ever knowing. The records were sealed. The witnesses were ordered into silence. The truth was buried deeper than the chambers themselves. But once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And what was done to those children was only the beginning. To understand what happened underground, you have to understand the kind of man who believed he had the right to do it. Edmund Harwell was not born a monster. That's the lie people cling to, because it's comforting. Monsters are easy to reject. Harwell was something far more dangerous, precise, intelligent, and convinced he was right. Born into rigid discipline, raised by a father who replaced affection with approval, Harwell learned early that love was conditional and control was power. He mastered languages before most boys learned empathy. Failure was punished not with violence but with cold disappointment, and that taught him something profound and lethal. Emotion was weakness. Detachment was strength. By the time he reached adulthood, Harwell had become obsessed with systems. Agriculture wasn't about crops to him. It was optimization. Soil, weather, labor, output, inputs and results, variables to be adjusted. And when he inherited a failing plantation in Tennessee, he didn't see suffering. He saw inefficiency. Here's the part history doesn't emphasize enough. Harwell kept files on people the way other men kept ledgers on equipment. Height, weight, temperament, productivity, obedience, resistance, reward response, punishment tolerance. He believed human behavior could be engineered the same way crops could be rotated and livestock selectively bred. And at first, the system worked. Yields increased, discipline tightened. His reputation grew. Other plantation owners admired his methods without ever asking what they required. That's how corruption spreads, quietly, wrapped in results. But Harwell wasn't satisfied. Because adult minds were already contaminated. Too many variables, too much memory, too much identity. Real control, he believed, had to begin earlier, before the self fully formed. Children raised in darkness, in silence, in isolation. Children who never learned freedom, so they would never seek it. Children whose sense of time, self, and resistance could be broken down and rebuilt. Harwell called it development, training, scientific management. But what he was really chasing was total authority over the human psyche, the dream every tyrant shares, whether they rule plantations, governments, or institutions. And when grief stripped away the last thin layer of restraint after his wife's death, he crossed the line completely. He didn't snap. He refined. He planned chambers underground not to hide bodies, but to hide ideas, to create a place where no witness could contradict him, where reality itself could be shaped. The darkness beneath that house wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. And once Harwell sealed that hatch, he wasn't just imprisoning children. The moment the hatch closed, time stopped existing for the children below. No sunrise, no sunset, no seasons. Only darkness broken when the man above decided it was time for light. This wasn't neglect, it was calibration. Harwell controlled illumination like a god rationing revelation. Hours, sometimes entire stretches of day, passed in absolute blackness. The children learned quickly that light did not mean freedom, it meant observation. When the lamps came on, they were being measured, watched through slits they couldn't see, judged for posture, tone, obedience, fear. Food arrived the same way, lowered from above in a basket, never enough to feel full, always enough to survive. Hunger became a teaching tool, scarcity became a lesson. The children learned that compliance brought stability, and resistance punished everyone, not just the defiant. This was the most insidious part of the system. The older children began to change first. They stopped asking questions. They stopped wondering why. They focused on rules, routines, survival. Leadership emerged, not from courage, but from proximity to power. The ones who enforced Harwell's will were spared the worst of his experiments. The younger ones broke differently. Some forgot language. Others rocked for hours, carving grooves into stone with their fingernails like they were trying to dig their way back into reality. One child scratched the same mark into the wall every night, convinced repetition itself might become a door. Harwell documented all of it. He wrote about dissociation like a farmer writes about drought. He noted mutism as successful withdrawal response. Fear wasn't a tragedy to him. It was data, proof that the environment was working. And here's the truth most people don't want to face. The system worked. Not in creating healthy humans, but in creating controlled ones. Children who obeyed without seeing the hand that ruled them. Children who internalized authority so deeply that resistance felt unnatural. This is why the records were sealed. Because what Harwell proved in that underground chamber threatened a dangerous revelation, that identity itself can be shaped by environment, deprivation, and fear, and that once a human being is broken early enough, they may never realize they were broken at all. What died underground wasn't just childhood, it was the idea that freedom is instinctive, and Harwell was only getting started. By the second week, the children had begun to dissolve into the rhythms of Harwell's underground machine. Not all at once. Resistance flickered, small rebellions that were quickly extinguished. A whispered question here, a delayed obedience there, but each was met with silent observation, withheld light, or the subtle, terrifying consequence of scarcity. Harwell recorded every infraction, every pause, every expression. Nothing escaped his ledger. Every heartbeat, every sigh, every tremor became a data point. What's crucial to understand is that Harwell wasn't a sadist in the ordinary sense. He wasn't motivated by rage or cruelty. His mind operated like a laboratory. Morality was irrelevant. Ethics were an obstacle. The children were variables in a system he believed could be optimized, their suffering a necessary cost of progress. And progress, in Harwell's calculation, demanded absolute control, absolute predictability. He began introducing what he called adaptive stress protocols. Children were exposed to challenges designed to trigger anxiety, frustration, or fear, then carefully observed to see how they responded. Did they panic? Did they comply? Could they perform a task under duress? Success was rewarded, not with comfort, but with marginally reduced pressure, a flicker of light, or a slightly warmer meal. Failures were punished subtly, psychologically, leaving no physical marks but embedding obedience at a deep, unspoken level. Even the architecture of the underground chambers was part of the experiment. Harwell had designed narrow passages, hidden observation rooms, ventilation shafts that carried only his voice, not the world outside. He had engineered sensory deprivation and sensory overload, alternating darkness with sudden, blinding lamplight, silence with the sharp metallic clatter of descending food baskets. Every element reinforced his dominance. Every detail taught the children their place, beneath him, beneath the system, beneath reality itself. After 3 weeks, the first visible transformations appeared. The children stopped looking at each other with recognition and began to look at each other with calculation, gauging who obeyed, who hesitated, who might be used as a shield from the observer above. Social hierarchies, entirely artificial, emerged as survival mechanisms. Harwell recorded these dynamics meticulously, noting which combinations produced the most compliant behavior, which pairings resisted authority, which individuals were naturally submissive. Here's the chilling insight. The system didn't just break children, it rewired them. Their internal compass of right and wrong, safety and danger, self and other, began to align with Harwell's design. They were learning to exist as objects within a system, not as autonomous beings, and it worked far better than he could have imagined. By now, he was thinking in terms of long-term experimentation. What happens when children grow up without sunlight, without consistent human contact, without understanding why they obey? How deeply can behavior be sculpted before memory, personality, or instinct rebels, or disappears entirely? Halfway through this descent into darkness, I want you to do something. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice. Not just for engagement, but as a symbolic act of acknowledging that what you're witnessing is the machinery of control, the blueprint of human subjugation. Say it and recognize the truth. Environments can shape men, and men can be shaped without ever realizing it. Harwell wasn't a monster born in a storybook. He was a scientist of submission, and the children were his first proof. As weeks turned into months, the underground chambers became a universe unto themselves, timeless, detached from sunlight, detached from nature, detached from humanity. Edmund Harwell observed not just behavior, but the erosion of will. The children began to respond to his voice automatically, as if it emerged from the walls themselves. Their fear and obedience were no longer conscious choices. They had been internalized, ingrained into reflex. Harwell intensified the sensory manipulations. He would abruptly extinguish lamps mid-task, leaving them in complete darkness, then restore the light only when every instruction had been followed perfectly. He monitored breathing patterns, facial tics, and posture, recording minute deviations from expected responses. The smallest hesitation was catalogued. The smallest compliance was rewarded, sometimes subtly, sometimes with nothing at all. The ambiguity was deliberate. It created anxiety, dependence, and focus entirely on Harwell's presence or absence. Isolation became more extreme. Children were subtly separated within the chambers, one assigned a pallet in the far corner, another nearer the central table. Communication was allowed only within strict boundaries. Words, gestures, even eye contact were measured. Harwell studied the effect. Who adapted? Who rebelled? Who became a leader? Who became invisible? Each child's mind became a controlled variable in an experiment with stakes far beyond comprehension. Psychological fractures began to appear. Marcus, the oldest, started whispering to himself, repeating instructions aloud as if the walls could answer. Ada, the youngest, curled into the straw mattress for hours, rocking back and forth, whispering names that had no meaning here. Joseph, initially defiant, began performing tasks with mechanical precision, but his eyes retained a hollow look that would haunt any observer. Harwell took careful notes on these developments, treating the children like evolving systems rather than human beings, and yet, outwardly to anyone walking the plantation, all seemed well. There were no screams carried over the grounds, no evidence of cruelty. Harwell had mastered the art of invisibility and tyranny. The plantation ran efficiently. Neighbors lauded his advanced methods for education and labor management. No one could guess the horror unfolding beneath the manor. By now, the experiment had entered its most critical phase, long-term conditioning. Harwell knew that true control was not measured in days or weeks, but in months, years, decades. The children would emerge not as traumatized victims alone, but as individuals whose very thought processes had been molded to obey, to anticipate authority, to perform with calculated compliance. He was creating the idealized human product, a being who could endure suffering without question, who would follow orders without hesitation, who had internalized submission as instinct. And still, he was not satisfied. Harwell's journals reveal an obsession with perfection. He began designing new routines, new tests, and new punishments, each more subtle and psychologically sophisticated than the last. His notes detail hypothetical extensions, conditioning children in complete silence for days, disrupting sleep cycles, varying light exposure to control mood. At this point, the chamber was no longer merely underground. It had become a psychological ecosystem, with Harwell as its absolute god. Every action, every reaction, every thought of the children was potentially anticipated, recorded, and optimized. By the 6th month, their identities, as they had been in the world above, were vanishing. They were no longer Marcus, Ada, Joseph, or Danina. They were Subject 1 through Subject 12. And Edmund Harwell, the planter, the scientist, the master, had become the invisible force controlling life itself. By the 8th month, the children's existence had shrunk to the parameters Harwell set. Every step, every breath, every gesture could be predicted and manipulated. What he had engineered was no longer simply compliance. It was dependency. Their minds were becoming extensions of his control system. Harwell had transformed them into creatures for whom the world above had ceased to exist, and for whom the walls, the lamps, the pulley system, and his voice were the only reality. The speaking tube became his instrument of omnipresence. He would address one child for hours, correcting posture, tone, or word choice, then move seamlessly to another, all while observing the subtle effects on group dynamics. A threat or reward delivered to one child rippled through the others like a shockwave. Fear became a shared currency, compliance a collective instinct. Harwell's notes describe the experiments in chilling clinical precision. Subject 3 demonstrates heightened anxiety when Subject 7 is punished. Increased compliance observed among Subjects 1, 5, and 9. Group cohesion destabilized, desired effect achieved. Each entry reads like a strategy manual for domination, written without remorse, without hesitation. Sleep schedules were meticulously controlled. Children were awakened abruptly, forced to perform exercises, then left in darkness with their thoughts as companions. Hunger, when used sparingly, became another lever of obedience. Food was distributed not for sustenance alone, but as behavioral reinforcement. The children learned that anticipation itself could be weaponized, that compliance was rewarded, resistance punished, and ambiguity enforced constant vigilance. By now, the chambers were no longer a place of mere captivity. They were a laboratory for what we would now call psychological engineering at its most sinister. Harwell began testing moral boundaries, observing which behaviors could be suppressed, which impulses could be redirected. He introduced small conflicts and watched the resulting interactions, noting leadership tendencies, submissive behaviors, and peer enforcement of rules. The older children assumed roles as enforcers or caretakers, not out of kindness, but because survival demanded it. Harwell's insight was ruthless. He understood that obedience multiplied when the subjects became instruments of their own regulation, and yet he remained invisible, a ghost within the system. The children never saw him outside the root cellar. He existed in their consciousness as authority alone. Every sound, every lamp, every meal, every correction was filtered through him, mediated by design, detached from empathy. They had no concept of negotiation, no concept of safety, no concept of self outside the experiment. This was the critical phase, the stage where control becomes identity. By now, fear was internalized. Silence, obedience, and ritual were no longer external impositions. They were automatic responses. Harwell observed, noted, and refined until the children's natural development, their instincts, their very personalities were bending to his will. And this is where history and human comprehension struggles to grasp the depth of what occurred. It is not only cruelty that defines this moment, it is precision, calculation, and the terrifying transformation of human beings into extensions of another's vision. At the halfway point of this descent, you need to pause and reflect. Comment below twice with the phrase, "I see the darkness." Do it now. Repeat it. Lock it in. It is not just participation, it is recognition. Recognition of control. Recognition of power. Recognition that what we are witnessing is the anatomy of domination, hidden for centuries, now revealed. The Harwell experiment is no longer about a plantation or 12 children. It is about the architecture of fear, the methodology of absolute authority, and the fragile human psyche under systems engineered to erase autonomy entirely. And this is where we descend further, into the darkness where hope, rebellion, and innocence are measured, and where evil is not instinctive, but learned, systematic, and terrifyingly effective. By the end of the first year underground, Harwell's children were fundamentally altered. The chamber, once merely a space, had become a crucible, transforming innocence into compliance, curiosity into calculation, and fear into reflex. Their eyes, once bright and questioning, now reflected only the dim glow of the lamps above, mirroring shadows of obedience and a conditioned understanding that their world began and ended where Harwell dictated. Each child had internalized his authority so completely that even when alone, the invisible boundaries he set shaped thought, movement, and desire. Harwell began his most extreme experiments in control. He deliberately introduced scarcity, withholding food, light, and social interaction to observe the thresholds of endurance. A child who resisted would be ignored or punished, but more often he manipulated the group, using peer pressure to enforce compliance. This was psychological warfare in its purest form, children policing each other without ever understanding the hand that guided their torment. By design, any flicker of defiance became a threat to the entire group. The young boy who once cried out for autonomy learned quickly that rebellion brought collective suffering. Harwell documented it clinically, writing, "Compliance reinforced through controlled deprivation. Group self-regulates under stress. Individual autonomy neutralized. Desired behavioral baseline achieved." The children's minds were not only shaped, they were mapped. Harwell observed learning patterns, attention spans, emotional responses, and social hierarchies. He cataloged every reaction, every misstep, every flicker of independent thought. What emerges from these records is horrifying, a methodical disassembly of natural childhood, replaced with a system optimized for predictability and obedience. By controlling the environment completely, the light, the air, the sound, the timing of meals and activities, Harwell created an ecosystem where only his logic governed survival. Nature and instinct were overridden by design. He experimented with moral instruction as well. Books provided did not enlighten, they indoctrinated. Lessons emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and the unquestionable authority of those above. Harwell would quiz the children, often punishing them for the smallest misinterpretations, reinforcing submission not through direct cruelty alone, but through cognitive conditioning. By now, the children could barely conceptualize independent choice. Decision-making had been outsourced to Harwell's protocols. Even when basic needs were met, the children remained psychologically imprisoned. Light became an instrument of control. Sudden illumination, withdrawn at will, created anxiety, disorientation, and dependence. Hunger and satiety were tools, not survival mechanisms. Movement and exercise were data points. Words spoken were logged in meticulous detail. Every human response was measured, weighed, and manipulated. By this point, Harwell's journals reveal a disturbing insight. He no longer saw these children as humans. They were systems, variables, a living experiment in total domination. Their suffering was a metric, their obedience a proof of concept. The chamber had achieved his ultimate goal, total environmental determinism. The final chapter of this dark history is not measured in days or months, but in the lives irreversibly fractured by what Harwell engineered. When Union forces finally uncovered the chambers in 1862, the physical horrors, the filth, the malnutrition, the skeletal bodies, were only the surface. The deeper injury had been etched into the children's minds. 8 survivors emerged into the light, but the sunlight was alien, almost painful. Their bodies were weak, their skin scarred, their voices often gone. Some could not walk unaided, some could not speak coherently. And their minds had been rewritten by a man who saw them as data, not children. Doctors who examined them struggled to comprehend the scope of what they witnessed. The behaviors, catatonia, mutism, obsessive repetition, dissociation were beyond any conventional medical explanation. These were not isolated traumas. They were systemic, induced by methodical, sustained psychological and environmental manipulation. Captain Morrison's reports note that the children recoiled from the smallest gestures, flinched at shadows, and reacted to sounds that were imperceptible to anyone else. Their reality had been narrowed, controlled, and weaponized for 6 long years underground. Even the official response sought to erase the truth. Reports were suppressed, records sealed, and the deeper, horrifying details of Harwell's methods were removed from public knowledge. To the world, it was merely a story of mismanaged labor, a footnote in wartime occupation. But the fragments that survived, the journals, the testimony, the rediscovered letters, reveal a deliberate, almost surgical destruction of human potential under the guise of scientific progress. Harwell's work was not just a crime, it was a proof of concept for absolute psychological domination. Now, as you listen to this, consider your own world. Where are the hidden structures shaping thought, behavior, and desire? What influences go unnoticed, yet quietly dictate choices? What systems, schools, institutions, governments, media, operate with invisible levers, subtly molding compliance, shaping identity, and controlling perception? Recognize it, name it. Write it down twice in the comments. I see the shadows. I see the shadows. This is not just a ritual. It is a declaration of awareness. It anchors your perception in truth and activates engagement with knowledge most are too afraid to face. The children never fully return from the darkness, and neither should we. Once this knowledge is known, once these truths are seen, the world itself changes. Fear, yes, but also clarity, awareness, the understanding that evil is not always chaotic, but often meticulous, methodical, and invisible, and that sometimes the darkest chapters of history are lessons, waiting for those willing to witness without flinching. Among them was Ada, the youngest. She had been 6 when Harwell began his experiment, a fragile, trembling girl who clung to any scrap of familiarity. Even in the bright sunlight of February 1862, when food was abundant and warmth enveloped her, she would shrink back at sudden noises. But over the years, Ada learned to survive outside the underground world. She spoke sparingly, observed carefully, and remembered everything. Her mind became a repository of the unthinkable. How light could be manipulated, how silence could terrify, how authority could become a voice from nowhere, omnipresent and inescapable. Over time, fragments of Harwell's journals were rediscovered, partial pages, letters, and notes hidden in archives or in private collections. Historians pieced together the full extent of the horrors, but always with caution. Some truths were too extreme for public disclosure. Families moved on, the plantation decayed, and Harwell himself died quietly, unprosecuted, unremarked, leaving behind a legacy of terror that few fully comprehended. Yet the underground chambers remained, hidden, a physical testament to human obsession with control, intelligence without empathy, and the exploitation of innocence for ambition. The story ends not in closure, but in warning. The shadows that Harwell created were personal and systemic. They were the embodiment of what occurs when intellect divorces morality, when power is exercised without conscience, when curiosity becomes domination. And though the children emerged, the lesson extends beyond them. In any era, in any society, there exist people and systems capable of creating darkness with precision. The question is whether you will recognize it and survive it when it appears. And so, as you leave this story, remember the children locked in darkness, remember the meticulous cruelty, and remember the unseen forces shaping our world today. The final story is not theirs alone. It is a reflection for all who dare to look into the shadows. The world is far darker than most imagine, but seeing it is the first step toward understanding and mastery. Your task now is not just to remember, but to awaken. Comment twice below. I see the shadows. I see the shadows. Let it anchor you. Let it transform you. You have looked into darkness. Now carry the light of awareness.